this is a crisis that is now spreading out to affect the whole of the world economy. And it's very important to see that this isn't just an American, or even American and British economy, because these were the economies where the speculation was developed in the most extreme ways. It's dragging in the rest of the world economy, because the US in particular expanded on the basis of the kind of speculative bubble in housing that I described. But what people spent on as a result of that bubble was on imports from the rest of the world, and most famously from China. Huge quantities of cheap manufactured goods being exported from China to the United States. So if America contracts, that hits China. But if it hits China, it then hits a whole series of other economies in the world. Manufacturing economies like Germany and Japan, who have essentially reorganized themselves in recent years to export to the more complicated components to China for final assembly. Third world countries producing raw materials that also have been increasingly exporting to China. So it's like a series, it's like a house of cards is collapsing. You pull out the American card and the whole world economy doesn't collapse completely, but it falls into a serious recession. And this recession already affects continental Europe, it already affects Japan, it's clearly going to grip the United States in the near future. So we're talking about an extremely serious economic crisis developing. Now let me say one very important thing. People sometimes accuse people who have the kind of Marxist analysis of capitalism that I've been trying to put forward, of saying that capitalism is bound inevitably to collapse. And therefore, some people might think that what I'm arguing is now the final crisis of capitalism has come and it's all going to fall apart. That isn't going to happen. Capitalism, to get rid of capitalism, you need not just a serious economic crisis, you need critically, the mass of working people from whose labour the profits of the system comes, to be determined to get rid of it as a system. It requires conscious political action to get rid of capitalism. As long as that conscious political action doesn't take place, then the system will revive. And the way it will revive is on our backs. It's very important to understand that, and to look, when we look at the responses that the rulers of the system are making. As I said, they're resorting to massive action on the part of the state. But, you know, if you wanted to prop up the economy, you could do all sorts of things. You could say, instead of doing all this silly stuff, manipulating property markets and interest rates, we could just put, you know, an extra, what should we say, £5,000 in the pockets of every adult in the country. And then with that additional spending power, that would stimulate the economy, and, you know, more people would get jobs and things like that. You know, in other words, they could subsidise in different ways the living standards of ordinary working people. But they're not doing that. On the contrary, and this is creating big political problems for them in Washington now, what they're doing is rescuing the very financial institutions whose greed and speculative recklessness helped to precipitate the crisis in the first place. And that's creating problems, because even the most right-wing Republicans don't want to be seen to be rescuing Wall Street and all the investment bankers with their huge bonuses and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, from the point of view of the people who run the system, they need the banking system to work. They need to rescue the banks because they're key instruments of their power, and that reflects their priorities. It's not a rational response to the crisis from a human point of view, but it's a rational response to the crisis from a capitalist point of view. But more important than that, their solution to the crisis is to make us pay for it. Now, the forms this take vary. One of the features of the present situation is a high rate of inflation, and in particular, prices rising very fast for basic commodities. And if we think they're rising fast here, and things in Tesco across the road are getting more and more expensive by the week, in much of the global south, the prices of those commodities are rising much faster. Now, what this acts as a way of massively squeezing the incomes of working and poor people around the world. Now, in our case, that's reinforced by in the case of Britain, by the public sector pay limit that Gordon Brown is sticking to insistently, holding public sector pay increases at 2% in a situation where even the official rate of inflation is now around 5%, means a significant cut in living standards. In the global south, the effect of the inflation can, in many cases, mean the difference between life and death. It can mean starvation. So they're making us pay. That's their plan. That's their fundamental response to the crisis. And again, in their own terms, this is a rational response. Because remember what I said, where this all started. This started in a crisis of profitability. That's what got them into this mess. If they want to get out of this crisis of profitability, then they have to increase the rate of profit. They have to increase the return on the investments that they make, because this is the critical criterion of success in the capitalist system. Capitalists invest in order to make as large a possible return on their investments. It's not a benevolent enterprise. You may have noticed that by now. So, to push up profits, they need to push down real wages. And that's what I mean, they're not, actually they're not concealing this. If you listen to Mervyn King, the governor of the Bank of England, he's perfectly open about it. He says some ridiculous things. He says nothing to do with me, Gov. I'm not responsible for all this mad financial speculation, which is, a bit odd since he's been in charge of the British financial system for a number of years. But he also says the whole thing is a big mess. Financial speculation got out of control. What we need is a serious recession to break the effects of this speculation, and we need a fall in living standards. In other words, he's very explicitly saying that ordinary working people are going to have to pick up the bill for the crisis produced by competition and speculation. And that is all, and if you listen to other leading figures, business leaders, central bankers elsewhere, politicians are often a bit more cowardly, that's really what they're saying. To get out of the crisis, they need to purge the system of the excess and the speculation and so on and so forth that took place during the boom, and they need to restore the rate of profit to a satisfactory level. And that, as I say, means they want us to pay for the crisis. Okay, so what do we do about that? Well, I think there are two critical things. There are two levels of response that are necessary. The first is simply to say no. In other words, we're not going to pay for your crisis. We're going to fight for increases in pay that protect and, if possible, improve our living standards. We're going to bust through the kind of pay limits that Brown is trying to impose in the public sector. And we should also be in favour of measures that protect and, if possible, improve the living standards of people who don't have a job and therefore lack the power, the collective power that workers at least potentially have through having jobs. And one very important feature of the present situation is that, as far as ordinary working people are concerned, the effects of this crisis are mainly so far being manifested not in high levels of unemployment, although unemployment is rising and will continue to rise, but in the form of inflation. In other words, prices cutting into people's living standards. Now, that's a situation. In other words, people are being squeezed, but they still have jobs. And while they have jobs, they have a lot of power to do something about their living standards being squeezed. It's not by accident that the last great wave of workers' struggles in the rich countries took place in the 1970s, when you had the same combination that we're confronted today with, of rising inflation, higher prices, and higher unemployment at the same time. So I think it's not, I'm not simply saying we should resist, I'm saying that the chances of effective resistance are quite good at the present time.